everyone, welcome to the Jayda and Stitches Show. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to add a fabric backing to an existing crochet or knit project, the size of a wall hanging, or a set of curtains, or a large blanket. Now we have an existing tutorial on how to add a fabric backing to something like a scarf, which is a little smaller, and in that video we used polar fleece, which is a non-fraying fabric. It's also very warm and cozy, and it's kind of thick, which makes it good for a scarf. We've linked that tutorial in the description box down below, and we have a video on creating a fabric lining for something three-dimensional, like an existing crochet or knit purse, and we'll link that in the description box down below as well. In fact, we've got a couple of those. In today's tutorial, we're going to be using a quilt cotton fabric. This is a thin cotton fabric, it is a woven fabric, and it frays. So we're going to discuss fraying fabric, how to use it, how to finish it, and how to add it to a blanket. This is a good fabric choice in this case because the larger your project, you don't necessarily want to add excessive weight to it. I mean, maybe a blanket you might, but for curtains, wall hangings, things like that, a thinner fabric is a good choice. But I do have a few fabric options for you, which we will discuss in today's video. You'll also see me bounce between the craft table and here in front of the camera as we move through the tutorial, because this is a larger project and I want to make sure that I can show you multiple angles, some of which don't necessarily fit on the craft table. So let's grab our wall hangings, our curtains, our blankets, whatever big crochet or knit project that you want to line. Grab some fabric, we'll talk about that in a second, and let's head to the craft table to start on what you're going to need in order to line your project. In addition to your crochet or knit project, you're going to want your fabric, a little bit more on that in a minute, a sewing needle and thread, a pair of scissors, a measuring tape, and some sewing pins or sewing clips. You see me use these as stitch markers all the time, but they're actually sewing clips. Both of these are great options. Their point is to keep your fabric from shuffling around as you attach it to the back of your crochet or knit project. Before you do any fabric shopping or stash diving, you need to know how much fabric you're going to need. So there's going to be a couple of measurements you need to take on your crochet or knit article, but you want to make sure that your crochet or knit article is in its completed state first. And by complete, I don't just mean you finished all the sewing, you finished all the crocheting, you have blocked it, if you're going to wash it, you've washed it, you've laid it flat to dry, it is complete. Washing and blocking can change the dimensions of a crochet or knit article, so it's very important that you do all that first before you start trying to add a much less stretchy piece of fabric to the back of it. Once your piece of crochet or knit is in its completed state, you can take its measurements. You want the length and the width of the back of it before the border. So you're going to measure the length and the width from edge where it meets the border to edge where it meets the border. Same thing for the length. You don't have to worry about any hanging tabs if it's a wall hanging or curtains. And if it's a blanket with a very solid border, so like it's just solid double crochets or solid single crochets, you can measure out into the border, but remember to measure about up to maybe the last row or the last two rows. You don't want your backing to show, so you don't want to see any of it peeking around the corners. And most of the time your border is kind of fancy, so you don't want it showing through the border. So I recommend that you just cover your crocheted article inside the main body of it. So you're going to measure from edge to edge, edge to edge, but where the edge meets the border of the project in its totality. Once you have that measurement, you can go fabric shopping. The fabric you're looking for are in one of two categories. So if you are new to crochet and marrying fabric to it, or you're new to sewing and you are really worried about fraying fabric, then I recommend you pick up either cotton flannelette, which is a thinner kind of fabric. It's not as thin as quilt cotton, but it's thinner. It's kind of warm, it's sort of soft, but it doesn't fray. Or polar fleece. Now you don't have to get super thick polar fleece. You can get a thinner polar fleece. The thinnest one you can find would be just fine. Sometimes they make like throw blankets out of that stuff. It's kind of thin. You don't need anything thick because this is just a backing for a project like this. But that doesn't fray either. So polar fleece or cotton flannelette are two very good options for this. They come in all kinds of different colors, prints, and there's a lot of it. It's very common and it's easy to find, so you'll be spoiled for choice if you go to the fabric store. If you're going to go the other way and you're going to go for the really thin quilting cotton, like I'm using, you're looking for either what they call a quilting cotton, which is what, comes in a lot of colors and prints. It's usually reserved for people who do quilting, or like a muslin. Cotton muslin is really good for backing all kinds of things, like curtains, blankets, stuff like that. And again, it's very easy to come across. It's in all the fabric stores. You'll be spoiled for color, for choice. And it's none of those options are very expensive, because cotton, acrylic, polyester, I think a lot of polar fleeces are kind of a polyester. It's not an expensive fiber. So you're not investing a whole lot in this particular fabric that's not necessarily going to be seen. And pro tip, go to the bargain bin. If you're hitting up the fabric store because you don't have any in your stash, go to the bargain bin first. This isn't necessarily going to be seen. Doesn't mean that it can't be cute, but you want it to be a lighter color so that it doesn't show through your project. And the bargain bin has all kinds of fabrics in it that are sort of usually the ends of a bolt, or maybe that's sort of like, there could be anywhere up to 2 or 3 yards in a bundle. Remember to keep how much you're going to need in your brain, but you might find what you're looking for in the bargain bin, and it'll be a lot cheaper, which is always a win in my book. So once you've settled on your fabric and you've brought it home or you've pulled it out of your stash, you want to wash it first. That helps get any of the extra shrinking that might happen in your fabric out of the way. It takes the dust and the bits and pieces and the extra little frayed bits that may have come off it in transit out of it as well. It's nice to work with a nice, clean smelling piece of fabric. If it's quilt cotton or muslin, you might want to give it an ironing. That will also do a little shrinking, but it'll also get all the ripples and wrinkles out of the way, which will allow for a better, more accurate measurement and ease of cutting. If you are stash diving like I am, and you are piecing a piece together, I recommend that you be familiar with sewing and allowances and all of that extra kind of the different measurements you're going to need when you are piecing pieces together. You might want to have a little bit more experience in that if you're piecing something together. Just go for straight lines and try not to do anything fancy. I had to piece together my fabric, which I will show you here. Because it is in my stash. It's a quilt cotton. It is nice and kind of whitish on the back because all of the print is on the front. And I had blocks of it, but not enough in the size that I needed. So I did some seaming. I don't even know if you can really see those seams. You can see the seams on the back. So I just seamed the whole thing together. And once I had done all my cutting and seaming, I cut and seamed together a much bigger piece than I needed. Then I washed it, ironed it, etc. before I did my final measurements in order to add it to the back of my wall hanging. Your piece of fabric is now washed, dried, ironed, and ready to be cut. You do not want to cut your fabric to the exact measurements of the back of your crochet or knit article. You want to cut it larger. So if your final piece of crochet was, say, 10 inches by 10 inches, you actually want to cut an extra 2 inches on either side. So in metric, that would be 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters, and you'd be actually adding an extra 5 centimeters per side, or in total, an extra 10 centimeters or 4 inches to your length, an extra 10 centimeters or 4 inches to your width. And that is so you have some play. You can finish your edges if need be, and you can fold over the edge as required so that you get a nice, clean looking edge on the back of your crochet or knit article. So give yourself extra fabric allowance when you are doing your cuts. It's another reason that you want this all ironed and washed beforehand so that when you cut it, it's not going to shrink on you. If you are piecing it together like I did, I recommend doing all of your piecing a much bigger piece than you think you need before you wash it, iron it, etc., and then cut it, just in case there's any kind of changes in the washing process. And then you can decide how it is you need to finish your edges. If you're using a cotton flannelette or a polar fleece, you do not have to really do anything to your edges. You'll just be folding them under, so you don't have to worry about finishing them. But if you're using a cotton print like this, then you're going to have a lot of fraying that you're going to want to worry about. So you've got some options. If you've got a serger like me, you can serge the edges. If you've got a sewing machine, you can just zigzag the edges. You can also just hand overlock the edges if you want that way. But if you don't have a sewing machine or you don't want to deal with any additional sewing, you can just get some fray check. It's like a fabric glue that you kind of run a little bead along the edges, tap down, and let it dry completely, and then it will stop your fabric from fraying. I am not an expert in the fray check area, so I would recommend doing a little bit of Googling or visit some YouTube videos on fabric fray check, just so you know what brands are out there and which one might suit you best. You're also going to want to consider your workspace. So depending on the size of your project, you need to have a fairly large flat workspace to work on. I'm in a bit of a cramped area, which is why I'm going to be between the craft table and the camera today showing you things, but this is slightly different. You're going to want to have a nice big open table to work on, or the floor, or even a bed if you don't have a lot of floor space. But whatever it is you're working on, I recommend giving it a nice cleaning first. So wipe down your craft table, or vacuum, wash down your floor if you're working on the floor, or even put a clean sheet down over top of your bed if you don't want to wash all of your bed sheets. Because you've just washed your piece of fabric, you've just washed and blocked your project, and you don't want to fill it with all the things that can accumulate on your craft table, your floor, or your bed. So be nice to your new project. Give it a nice, clean, flat workspace to work on. Once you're ready to start putting all your pieces together, you're going to take your wall hanging, your curtains, your blanket, whatever it is, and lie it face down, so the good side facing down on your work surface. And then you're going to take your fabric backing, making sure that you've got it correctly oriented and with the right side facing up. So you want the pretty side facing out, you want the not so pretty side facing the wrong side of your crochet or knit project. Lay it out, and then you can take an iron if you're using a quilt cotton like this, and just quickly iron the edges down all the way around on your ironing board. But you don't have to do that. What you can do is just fold under the top, and you want to do this whether you're using the quilt cotton that's been finished with a serger or with your fray check, or whether you're just using a non-fraying fabric. You want to fold the edge under, and then you're going to grab your pins or possibly your fabric clips, whatever you might be using, and just start pinning them into place. I recommend that you do your 4 compass points first, so the top all the way down to the bottom, and then the 2 sides, and then you start filling in the inside bits, because it is going to want to move around on you. The larger your piece, the more it might want to move. And it's much easier to fiddle with turning under your edges and pinning it into place if you do the main 4 points first and then start quietly doing them in between, because you don't want it to kind of end up going crooked on you, and that might happen if you're trying to just go all the way around in one direction. So do the top first. Try not to knock stuff off your work surface. Do the bottom next, and then do the east-west compass points. And if you've got a lot more fabric than you think you need, that's okay. You're just making some very initial pin points, because eventually you might need to move the whole thing around. So it's always better to have too much fabric than not enough. So this is what I call the preliminary pinning. Get your compass points in place first. Don't pull your backing too taut, because you don't want to risk your fabric pulling your wall hanging or your curtains or your blanket out of its correct shape. If anything, the back of your piece, your fabric, should be a little bit loose. There should be a little bit of give back here, and that will allow your blanket or your wall hanging or your curtains to move appropriately. Remember, you're trying to marry together 2 very different kinds of fabric. One that has got a very tight weave, whether it is woven or a knit fabric, it's very tightly done because it was probably made using a machine, and the much larger open work of your hand crochet or knit. So this is going to have a much different motion requirement than the stuff you're putting on the back. So be nice to your crochet or your knitting. Make sure that your fabric piece has a little bit of extra give, and that's another reason you want that extra allowance of fabric on all 4 sides. It's so that if you Pin it so that there's a little bit of play in the back. It'll save your blanket or your curtains or your wall hanging, which might want to stretch a little bit over time. It'll save it from hanging in a funny way or being caught up on one corner if you give a little bit of I want to say allowance, I guess that's the best word, a little bit of play to the fabric that you're backing your piece with. Corners don't have to be some special fancy mitered affair. Basically, I like to keep it simple. I finish folding down one edge, let's say the bottom, and then I just fold down the other edge. So this, and then maybe that. And I just end up with a bit of a corner. And remember, pinning isn't permanent. Pinning isn't permanent. Say it to yourself, pinning isn't permanent. You're just keeping that fabric in the general area that you need it. I also like to have that extra fabric at the corners in case I need that play a little later on. Once you're all pinned into place, take a moment to flatten it out, slowly move your hands around the backing to make sure there aren't any pleats or wrinkles or folds that you kind of missed when you were busy pinning. And just make sure that all relatively lays flat and looks flat. If it's curtains or a wall hanging, I recommend hanging it up in place just to make sure that it doesn't look like it's hung up somewhere or there's maybe like a little bit of tension. You want to make sure that as you're sewing this down, it relatively gets sewn down in the same place that you pinned it. But like I said, pinning isn't permanent. So the pins are just there to keep the fabric in roughly the place that you want it as you sew. The real careful attention is paid to the actual sewing part. So the pins are going to keep the fabric in place, but the sewing is permanent. So before you start sewing, just give it another shot, another little look, hang it up, make sure everything looks like it's relatively in the right place. What needs to be covered is covered, what shouldn't be covered isn't covered, and that there isn't any strange pulling, torquing, twisting, rippling, pleating, anything like that. Now it's time to start sewing. I recommend sewing it in pieces too. Just like you pinned it, you're not going to just start sewing and go all the way around your entire perimeter. I recommend starting in the middle and then sewing a little bit out to one edge, then going back to the middle and sewing out to the other edge, and just sort of doing the top first because the top is probably the most important part. Be very careful about those pins, and as you can see here, I don't have it fully lined up against the top edge, so that's something I want to address while I'm sewing. So if I take out that needle that's right at the top, that sewing pin, I realize that I need to unravel a little bit of my folded edge so that when I lay it down, it is right against that edge of the tab and where it meets the back of my blanket. And then I'm just going to slowly unfold or refold the fabric as I go and I sew it down. You're going to cut a nice long length of thread. I like to double it up and then put the knot of the two ends together. I'm going to start right in the middle. I'm going to anchor my sewing thread first on the inside of my fabric. And then I recommend working flat on your surface. I will pick it up for demonstration, but you want to work flat on your surface, and you are not sewing all the way through the fabric. You are only sewing to the back facing loops of the crochet or knit part of your actual project. I'm going to be using the whip stitch, and I really do recommend doing this by hand. It gives you much more control and it moves slower, so that you have time to decide as you work whether or not you need to unravel or refold your fabric and your, like as it sort of lies down against your crochet or your knitting. And you can hide those stitches. So this little simple whip stitch, and keep your whip stitches about 1 centimeter apart. A centimeter is just a little bit thinner than the width of your index finger. That gives the fabric and the difference, so the difference between the weave of the fabric and the stitch of your crochet or your knit article gives it some room to breathe and move. You don't want it to be too tightly attached to the back of your sewing or knit project, because it will warp it. So every baby finger or so, and then you're just getting the back of the fabric of your crochet article. There's a little bit of thread there. And as you go, you can decide, oh, I need to unravel it a little bit, or I need to wind it back up. And you're grabbing the cotton or the crochet loop. You're not going all the way through the fabric. These are kind of invisible stitches. They're just going to be concealed on the back. And your actual sewing stitches, you're always, this is what we call a whip stitch. You're always, it's like an overlock stitch. You're always going around the edge of the fabric. And I'll get a couple more in here. So each of these stitches is about a baby finger or a centimeter apart. It's got a little bit of give, so if I show you there, it's connected to that edge of the blanket, just down a little bit from the very edge where it meets with the border. So when it is viewed from this side, you won't see it peeking through that space between the border and the blanket itself. So I'm just stitching it down right there to the edge of the actual wall hanging. And I'm going to go all the way out to the corner, knot off, reload my needle, come back to the middle, stitch all the way out in the other direction. You can do this going in the other direction. Again, you want to keep your stitches about a finger width apart, just so that you've got a little bit of play between those two pieces of fabric. I now have the top sewn down. So I started in the middle and I went first in one direction, and then I came back to the middle and I went in the other direction. And that gives me a chance to kind of pat the fabric down, move the fabric as I see it needs to move, unroll and re-roll that hem a little bit as I'm working, and that will give me more or less an even edge. Now when I say even, I mean it follows the line, the more organic line, along the edge of the top of my crocheted article, as opposed to trying to fit it into a straight line. I'm much more interested in it covering the back of this neatly without showing through to the front than I am about it being a perfect rectangle or a perfect straight edge. I want it to be able to move with my crocheted article, so my stitches are like a centimeter or a baby pinky apart, and I'm stitching it in just below the edge. So just down from the edge of the actual finished, the last row basically before the border of my project, I'm stitching it just below that. I'm using the back loops of those crochet stitches. I am not sewing all the way through the article because I don't want any of my sewing stitches to show through to the front. People do use sewing machines to sew fabric to crochet. I don't like using sewing machines for that purpose. I feel the yarn often gets caught up in the feed dogs of the machine. Sometimes the foot catches the odd loop. And then of course you see the stitching to the front, or you see the line, the indication of the stitching showing through to the front. Now sometimes that's a design choice. I'm cool with that. And other people are quite comfortable using a machine on crochet or knit articles. I'm not, so I prefer to do it by hand. And if you're new to this kind of thing, I recommend doing it by hand. It's a little more time intensive, a little more laborious, but it does give you the opportunity to be careful about where your stitches are going and to react in real time to the movement of that fabric and where it kind of needs to go in order to follow the somewhat organic lines of our crochet. Once you've done the top do the whole repinning thing if necessary again. I like to hold it up, make sure that there's enough play there. You see if I wiggle this back and forth, there's play in the fabric. I want that because then when my project is hanging on the wall in the future, the project itself isn't going to kind of want to start to hang up on one corner or the other. As I work, I'm going to slowly work halfway down the sides next. I'm going to do the bottom sewing last because I want to make sure that I'm smoothing from the center out to the edges. I'll show you what that looks like over on the craft table. You can start on one side or the other. It doesn't really matter. Maybe I'll start over here on the right. But you're going to start up at the top corner, work down maybe a quarter or a half, and then do the same thing on the other side. Start up here at the corner, work down maybe a quarter or a half. And as you're going, you're just sort of starting in the middle and you are smoothing your backing out. You always take from the middle, smooth to the edges. And again, you don't want this to be flat or taut against the back of your project. You want there to be some play, but you also don't want to have any rippling, pleating, bunching of the fabric. You want it to be relatively smooth so that it sits evenly across the back of your piece. This is easier to do on a smaller thing like a wall hanging or little kitchen curtains, but it's the same concept the bigger you get. So I'm going to start up here in the corner. I've already knotted the kind of ends of my thread together. And I'm just going to continue to do the same thing. I'm looking for the edge of my piece. I am stitching it using the back facing loop of a stitch of the actual piece of crochet. Then I'm running my needle through the edge of the folded fabric. And as I go, I am unrolling or re-rolling as I see fit, keeping my stitches about 1 centimeter or a pinky's width apart. And I'm only going to do about a quarter. I'm going to knot off, come back up to the top on the other side, and continue to work from the corner down. I'm always smoothing out that fabric as I go to make sure that it hasn't moved or bunched up on me. And as I need to, I unroll or re-roll that hem as I stitch it down. I'm all the way to the bottom now, and you might find, you may not, but you might find that your bottom sort of has bunched up a little bit as you've slowly sort of smoothed your way down and stitched down your edges. So all you want to do when you get to the bottom, and by the way, make sure when you take out a straight pin, you put it back in your little pin container or your pin cushion, just so you don't end up dropping it or stepping on it later. It's hot weather, so I'm stumbling around in my bare feet, and the last thing I want to do is get a pin in the toe. You can just get to the bottom and you can take the time to re-roll your hem if you need to. And I recommend starting like you did originally from the middle and then working your way out. So you sort of repin that middle bit and then sort of smooth out the bottom 2 edges. And the same thing over here. And you're just kind of, I like to roll it by rolling it between my fingers just so that it smooths, that little fold is smoothed up along the bottom edge. And a little bit of give at the bottom is perfectly okay. So I've just pinned it in 3 places. And now, just like at the top, I'm going to start in the bottom middle and slowly smooth and stitch my way out to the corner, come back, and do it out in the other direction, and the whole back will be stitched on. I stitch until I run out of thread. I don't worry that if I can't quite make it all the way to the end. I make sure that I have enough to knot off, and then I'll just reload my needle and I'll sew up that little bit at the end. I don't do anything special when I'm knotting off. I basically just grab the same little place where my last stitch was, run it through the end, and then I loop my needle through the loop of the thread. And I do that a couple times in roughly the same place. Sometimes I run my needle underneath the little knot that I'm creating, and I do it again. There we go. And then, just to kind of keep all those little tails from showing, I'll take my needle and I'll press it into the inside of the fabric, run it sort of inside the fabric, bring it out a little bit further, and then I will snip it here, careful not to snip my fabric, and that will keep the little tails from showing, and it looks a little bit neater. All done! So now my project is going to hang on the wall comfortably. Nothing is going to keep it kind of, it's not being pulled up. It has lots of play. So in that fabric backing, there's some play there. I didn't crochet or sew it down tautly. I feel like it's worth adding that if you're making something really big, like a much bigger wall hanging that's heavy and might kind of stretch down over the, the years, or curtains, you don't actually have to sew your backing to the bottom edge of your project. You can just leave it open. You might want to fold it up and tack the lining to itself, but not actually to the project. And that's just so as things kind of hang and it stretches out a little bit, the fabric, which doesn't want to move, will not impede the bottom of your project from kind of just weighting down a little bit. It won't, over time it might, like especially curtains, the bigger the project, they might want to look like they're kind of bubbling up at the bottom just because the fabric is kind of holding that bottom edge up, whereas the rest of it is kind of wanting to sag down a little bit. If you find down the road, after a couple washings, I hand wash everything, so I still recommend you would do that, especially if you've added a fabric backing. If you find over the years or as the time passes things sag a little bit and you have stitched the bottom, not a big deal. Just undo the stitches at the bottom and let the bottom of your crochet project kind of stretch itself back out. And you can just tack that bottom lining to itself. So it doesn't actually have to be connected at the bottom. And that's fine too. I have done that. My grandmother lined one of my sweaters like that and didn't attack the lining to the bottom, and it's the same thing. So as you wear the project, it doesn't, it's going to stretch out a little bit, even if you've washed it and you've stretched it and you've blocked it and done all that. The heavier a piece, like a wall hanging with a lot of appliques on it, for example, the more it may wish to stretch over time. You'll find that with bigger projects like curtains and big heavy wall hangings. Not so much with the smaller pieces or the kitchen window curtain size thing. So smaller projects, not such a big deal. Now I have stitched the bottom of my lining to the bottom of my project because I just wanted to do the whole thing. But down the road, if I find that it's sagging a little bit, I'll just unpick those bottom stitches in where the lining attaches to the bottom, and I will re-stitch the lining just to sort of to itself, and I'll leave it open, and that's fine too. That works just fine. The whole point of lining something like this is just to give it a little extra strength, to give it a little bit of smoothness. When this now sits against the wall, the fabric of the crochet project will not be rubbing against the wall. Not that it's going to blow around a lot, but it'll be fabric instead. It also just is a nice way to finish something. So for example, if you were doing a project like our garden wall hanging, and you had a whole lot of stitching showing to the back, now you've put a backing on. It's the same thing with a fancy blanket. If you want to line the blanket, it makes the blanket warmer, it makes the blanket neater, it gives it more strength because it's holding the four corners and the four sides together. And if it's a really fancy blanket with a lot of extra stitching or joining or something and you don't like the way the back turned out looking, if you line it, now it's just pretty and it's all just one pretty color. So I'm really quite pleased with the way that turned out. I can now put my hanger in the little tabs, hang it up on the wall, and that is the garden wall hanging project complete. And if you were here to figure out how to add a backing to another kind of large flat project, I hope you found this video helpful. Please let us know down below if there are any other fun tips or useful tricks or efficiencies that you know of by adding cotton or fabric to the back of crochet or knit articles. Like I say, I'm by no means an expert in this. I love to sew and I love to crochet, but I only marry the two together every so often. So if you know of some great tips that you think might help out other people, please feel free to leave them in the comment boxes down below. I also would be happy to read them too. This works for me. I've lined other projects like this. I've done scarves like this. I've lined purses and whatnot the same way, and I always do it by hand because I feel like it gives me a lot more control. And to date, I haven't had anything fall apart, so I think that it works well enough. And if you're a beginner, this is a nice way to kind of slowly ease your way into lining things. But to be fair, the expert seamstresses in my family still do everything by hand, and they swear by it. So I'll take a little nod out of their book, and I will maybe continue to do things by hand. I like the way it looks, and I like being in contact with that piece of art right from the beginning through to the end. I think it's kind of neat. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and for hanging out with us today. We will see you soon here on the Jayda and Stitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have a great week. Bye, guys!
Hi, everybody. Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.